There's work still to do at Sutton Hoo.
Those burial mounds are clinging to their secrets, and we're determined to find out more.
Discover what could be hidden beneath the soil and how it got there on the Time Team podcast.
Welcome to the Time Team podcast with Helen Geake and Martyn Williams. I'm one of Time Team's archaeologists, which means I get to travel the length and breadth of the country, working on some of the many projects that Time Team's been involved with over the years, from Roman villas and Anglo-Saxon hoards to Iron Age hill forts and medieval burial sites. But when I'm not doing that, my day job is working for the Portable Antiquities Scheme. I'm called a Finds Liaison Officer, which means I record archaeological finds made by members of the public. So if you find something while you're metal detecting, or you're gardening, or walking the dog, or on the beach, you can bring it to me, or somebody like me, and we'll record it on the internet so that everybody can benefit.
I am neither an archaeologist or a finds liaison officer. What I am, though, is really interested in learning more and discovering the secrets that lie beneath our feet. And that is what we do together here on the Time Team podcast. And just to say, Helen, just before we get into things, thank you so much if you took the time to send us a message about our previous episode. It was a question and answer special. And by way of a thank you to all the Patreon supporters who've sent us questions, we've made that episode actually available to watch as well as to listen to over on our Patreon site. So you can go and see me and Helen and Derek Pittman answering your questions over there. It was really, really good fun as well. We will have to do another one in the future. Patreon.com/TimeTeamOfficial is where you need to go.
But let's get on with this episode now, shall we? Because we've got a lot to pack in. And 2025 is a big year for Time Team, and one of the things that we're really excited about is our return to Sutton Hoo. Now, Sutton Hoo is famous across the world for its amazing Anglo-Saxon burial mounds and the discovery of an intact Anglo-Saxon ship inside one of them, Mound 1, back in the 1930s. And that's a story that you might know if you've seen the film The Dig on Netflix.
On this episode of the podcast, we're going to be looking a little closer at Sutton Hoo, and that longship as well in particular. It would have been enormous, and to have buried it in one of those mounds, you can't imagine it was a particularly mean feat. I mean, it's impressive that they managed to do it, and it's really captured people's imagination to think what it would have maybe looked like for real and how it would have been used.
Yeah, and one of the things that people forget about Sutton Hoo is that Mound 1 had the intact ship. Mound 2 had a ship that had been robbed many times, and all there was a scatter of ship rivets. So they didn't do it just once, they did it twice. It's exerted such a pull on the imagination that a team have been working for, quite a few years now, just down the road from Sutton Hoo in Woodbridge, creating a replica of the ship that's been built using authentic methods. And back in the summer, Martyn paid them a visit.
My name's David Keeble, and I'm the volunteer coordinator for the Sutton Hoo Ships Company. And we're in the long shed at Wistock's Place in Woodbridge, where we are building a replica, as near as we can, of the ship that was buried in Mound 1 at Sutton Hoo.
What strikes me first of all is just how big it is.
It's 88 feet, so it's full length.
We're in this enormous shed, and all around us are these wood shavings, huge tree trunks, and then they're being turned into planks of wood. This is a proper working area. Can we go and explore a little bit more?
Yeah, we've got the platform at the end of the ship, so we'll walk up and we can look down the ship and see it sort of full glory, really.
Oh wow, you get a totally different perspective from here.
So what we're looking at we're standing right up at the stern. As we look down the ship, you can see all the black temporary moulds, or templates as they are called.
So everything in black we're looking at isn't going to stay.
And that's everything painted black is just temporary, and they are temporary moulds We're using them because we are building a replica, and that's to ensure that we maintain the hull profile accurately, and also to assist our volunteers, most of whom have never built a ship before, so to assist them in maintaining the right shape.
Ready?
Chaps, can I interrupt you in the middle of all this banging? What's your name?
Mac.
And
Todd.
what are you doing?
We're putting rivets in, iron rivets. The first thing to do is we drill a hole, then we put we call it a nail, but it's an iron rivet in the hole. He's knocking the washer on the end. Whoa, stop. Yep. Open it. All right, cut.
Whoa.
All right, so now we got a little bit sticking up there.
There's a little bit sticking up there.
That's going to get mushroomed over with the ball-peen hammer.
You're the basher, Todd, is that right? Yeah.
He's the basher. I'm the one taking the bashing.
Okay.
It's like getting hit with a hammer.
This is difficult work. This is very physical work. There must be thousands of rivets on this. 4,000.
Okay, go ahead.
All right.
Yep.
You two are both volunteers. Why did you want to get involved in this? Why did you want to help this project?
I enjoy archaeology, and my brother, who's built a few boats before, smaller ones, of course, but I thought it'd be a good idea for him and I to come here, so we did a King for a Day last September. Came here and did a little volunteer work, and I've enjoyed it. But once we see this thing floating, that's going to be even the best part. Everybody enjoying it. That's the best part I will look forward to.
Just looking down the length of this ship now, those pieces of wood painted in black that are acting as a mould, a guide to build this, almost look like some great whale skeleton or carcass, don't they? I'm interested to know, what would a ship like this have been used for in Saxon times?
This ship is generally thought to be a warrior ship, one that was built for speed, to demonstrate somebody's power and authority. It was clearly built for somebody of great status, somebody who had immense power and could command the sort of respect and the resources that would have been necessary to build a ship of this size.
And how would it have been propelled? Is this an oar type situation? Is there a sail involved?
Yeah, the question of sail is a very contentious one. We don't know, basically. There's no evidence that it had a sail. There's no evidence that there was any mast fittings. There were definitely 28 oar positions, 14 either side. It was rowed, coastal rowing boat. We don't know for sure. There's just no evidence. All we can say is there's no evidence of a mast.
So I'm Laurie Walker, I'm the first shipwright involved in the project. This is going to be a finished plank at the end, and I'm just taking the sides down to a finished width of 1.16 inches.
Over to our right are actual tree trunks that have come in, and you've been sort of just getting them to look more like planks.
Basically, so we went off-site and cleaved this log, which has happened to come from Audley End. The first stage is to go along and notch it using an axe. So I worked my way along the board, working to a line that we've put on with a batten.
And how close to the actual technique that would have been used to build this ship is what you're doing?
I think it's fairly close. I mean, we don't know exactly, but as close as we can get. I've been a boat builder for 15 years, but sort of doing this and getting back to the traditional ways and looking at a tree and reading it and knowing where the knots are and how to go about splitting the tree. Those are all things that I've learned in the last sort of 3 years of working on this project, so it's been really brilliant.
And what are you planning to do with this ship once you've managed to finish this restoration work?
The idea is to test it out, retracing the steps that it may have made in the day. And that's the idea, to test it, to find out how it performs, how they would have used it, all of the factors that we can't tell just from a hole in the ground, really.
I I think that really emphasises how much we need the ship project to help us understand what was going on at Sutton Hoo in the 7th century. It's such a giant, Martyn. It's twice the length of the kind of coach that you might go on a coach trip on, and yet it contains the same number of people. So you have to imagine them spread out much more, but it is absolutely giant. And because of this, we've got very little idea about how it's going to move on the water. So we need to find out not only how it might have been built by building it, but we need to find out how it might have been used by actually using it, travelling in it.
So it means that it's not just really, really good fun, which I imagine that it will be, and it's going to look amazing, but it also will be really useful for archaeologists and historians to learn something about the ship that is buried at Sutton Hoo. The story, by the way, of that longship doesn't end there, because that was back in the summer when I was there. How are things looking now? Let's speak to project manager Jack Barnard. Jack, how's it going then?
Hi, well, it's all very positive. So earlier in the year, we were struggling to find the very wide trees that we needed for the wider planking. But through a social media campaign and lots of hard work, we've managed to get a bit of a pipeline of timber coming into the longshed. So at the moment, if you visit us, you'll see that there are some great big trees outside waiting to be cleaved.
Well, that's really brilliant. It sounds like it's going very well. But there has been a bit of an extra challenge, hasn't there, Jack? What's happened?
Yes, well, anyone who's followed our project will know that we've always had issues with the building that we're actually using. But, fortunately, through, again, lots of hard work, we've managed to find a solution, and we will be moving to a new home in the near future. When the ship has been built, it will go on the water, and then we will move to our new accommodation, which is probably about a 5-minute walk from where we are now.
Goodness, so that's really kind of thrown a bit of a spanner in the works for a while. I mean, it's glad to hear that you've got a plan, but how concerned were you at the time that you might kind of have to move out of where you were before the ship was actually ready to leave?
Yeah, well, I mean, this has been a problem that we've had for many years, in that the building that we're in has never been ours. We've always been a guest there. We've had no legal rights whatsoever. That only has caused restrictions in the space within it that we can use, which, from a build point of view has been quite difficult. But also it stops us fundraising because we have no legal rights to be there. So therefore funders don't see any sort of longevity in what we're doing. So we need a much firmer footing if we're going to complete the ship and continue into the future by doing subsequent builds. The trustees have worked really hard to try and resolve the issues that we've experienced in the longshed where we are, but that hasn't led to anything positive. So through sort of sheer exasperation, really, we started to think about it in a different way. So we started to look for an alternative location. Initially, it looked like it would be taking us away from Woodbridge because we couldn't really see a suitable site in the immediate vicinity, which would be a huge shame given that at the moment we are literally across the water from the Sutton Hoo site. Purely by chance and word of mouth and sort of hearing what was going on in the area, we heard that another boatyard which historically has been called the Robertson's Boatyard, had space available. And so we entered into conversations with them, and we're now at that stage where we are trying to sort out what a long-term contract will look like to give us a lease for at least 20 years.
Oh, well, that is such a relief. So they'll hopefully be a bit of stability really for you now after all this turmoil. I just can't wait to see it in action. The launch is going to be absolutely spectacular. Have you got any idea of timelines for when you're hoping to be able to actually get it out of the shed and into the River Deben?
Well, it's very difficult to say, but all being well, we're talking about 2026. We've learned over the years that what we expect in the modern day to be an issue that can be quite easily resolved isn't necessarily going to be the same as what you experience when you're building something in an authentic Anglo-Saxon way. So we never anticipated not being able to find the size of timber that we needed. We always knew it would be hard work getting it, but we didn't realise that there was just very little of it out there. So hopefully, this pipeline of timber will see us through to the hull being finished. But then in managing projects, I've always looked a long, long way ahead. But with this one, I try to just worry about what's happening in the next 2 weeks. And then, because you just never know what's around the corner. But, all being well, we very much want to get it on the water, and we very much want to move to our new site as soon as we can, because it will give us, a lot more autonomy, a lot more ability to welcome our guests in a much better way. And we're just very excited about doing that. So we want to get there as quickly as we can. So, our emphasis is definitely on getting the ship to a point that it can be on the water, whether it's completely finished at that point, because we could always take it to our new site to finish some of the internal work on it. But hopefully 2026, you should see some action.
Brilliant. Looking forward to it. Jack, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is the Time Team podcast, looking ahead to Time Team's return to Sutton Hoo later this year. And while we're talking about Sutton Hoo, Helen, we should probably chat about this new study that's just been published. It's been written by the historian Dr Helen Gittos from the University of Oxford, who puts forward this new theory about how some of the amazing sort of opulent items found in some of the graves at Sutton Hoo actually got there.
That's right. In the past, it's been suggested that the objects in graves like Mound 1 and the other mounds, as you say, that were made abroad, things like the Syrian textiles or the ancient Roman silverware or those bronze and brass bowls and jugs that came from the Byzantine world, it's been suggested that they came to England as diplomatic gifts or in exchange for other goods, a kind of early trading network. Now, although, as you say, Helen Gittos is mainly a historian, she's also incredibly good at handling archaeological evidence. And she's combined the two really deftly in this article to show that there's plenty of evidence for a different idea, that they were brought here by men who had served in what they probably thought of as the Roman army. But we tend now to call the Byzantine army because the capital of the Roman Empire had been moved to the eastern city of Byzantium, which had been renamed Constantinople and is now called Istanbul. It's the city with the most names ever. So it wasn't at Rome, but they still would have thought of it as the Roman army. I'm really pleased to say that Helen is with us now. Hello, Helen.
Hello, Helen.
There's always we're the two Helen G's of Sutton Hoo fans, aren't we? So we do occasionally get confused for each other, but it's lovely to have you with us. Can you explain the basics of your research? You found a piece of old evidence and combined it with new archaeology and come up with something with a really different idea, haven't you?
That's right. I've been really puzzled for a very long time about why it is that there are so many objects from the Eastern Mediterranean that are found in Sutton Hoo, but also of similar cemeteries from that date elsewhere in Eastern Britain. And I suppose I've been looking at distribution maps of these objects and realising that they were quite new when they were deposited in these graves. The vast majority of them were things that were contemporaneously in use in the Eastern Mediterranean when we find them in Britain. And so I've been trying to work out, how do we explain how they got there? There was a moment in lockdown when I read something which helped me understand what I hadn't realised until that time. In 575, there was this huge recruitment campaign that the Byzantines conducted in Western Europe. They sent scouts to recruit an entire army, 10, 15,000 men, something like that. And they were cavalry soldiers, but probably also supported by foot soldiers too. That army then went back to the east to fight on the Eastern Front, the old enemy of the Romans, the Sasanian Empire. We know a lot about where they went because we've got historians at the time that document this army.
And how much precedent is there for that sort of thing happening at around that time? People going out and recruiting armies from far, far, far away?
So there are two answers to that. One is that it's something that happened a lot. And the Roman Empire had recruited barbarian federate troops repeatedly, and that carried on going right the way through into the late Middle Ages. On the other hand, it happens at very specific episodic moments. It's not something that's always happening. It's something that you have to put a lot of energy and money into doing, and you do it at very particular times. And one of the reasons why I carried on pursuing this idea, I suppose, was because I realized that the chronology is very, very tight. It's quite precise in the moments of time when these things are happening, even though the actual habit of doing it is something that persists.
And are they then being recruited for payment, or are they being sort of rounded up in a conscription kind of a way?
I think the answer is that we don't really know, but the sources that talk about it are sort of critical almost of the amount of money that's being lavished on these people. How I imagine it is that the word goes out. Why is it attractive? It's attractive because it's an adventure. You were given a grant of money to pay for your weaponry and your armour and material also for your horse. So each individual soldier then is in charge of equipping themselves as part of their pay. But presumably it is always the case that armies have the opportunity to grab loot along the way as part of their campaigns. So I think there's a whole range of reasons why it was attractive for people to join without any need for conscription at all.
But am I right in thinking that the historical sources don't actually mention the Anglo-Saxons or people from Britain taking part in this, that you've had to use quite a lot of circumstantial evidence? There's this feeling that, Britain's an island, we'd have had to get into a ship. This is something that you're sticking your neck out slightly and pushing the historical evidence this far, but you've got so much archaeology, haven't you, to back you up?
The historical sources don't talk in detail about where the soldiers were being recruited from. It's more that the modern historians have assumed that they were coming from the Franks and the Lombards and the Gepids and whatever. There are a few hints. There is a commander with the name of Godwin, and one of the very few people who made this kind of suggestion before is Michael Whitby, who'd said, hang on a minute, that might be an English name.
Yes, because very familiar from the other end of the period with Harold Godwinson, who got defeated at the Battle of Hastings.
That's right. So the information about where these people are coming from is pretty fragmentary. We don't have anything precise that says that there were Anglo-Saxons involved, but it seems to me to be highly likely at a time when we can see from the archaeology that these were fighting men worth recruiting with extraordinary weaponry, who were as obsessed with horses as everyone else was in Western Europe at this time. And so that, coupled with the very unusual Eastern Mediterranean stuff, gave me the courage to start playing with this as an idea and an explanation.
Well, we're so glad that you did. This certainly changes the understanding of how those amazing, opulent, as I mentioned, items got into the ground in the first place. How much, though, does it change our understanding of Sutton Hoo as a site and what was going on there?
And actually, here, I think we ought to bring in the fact that since your article came out, it has been slightly controversial, hasn't it? Because some people have felt that you are, in saying that maybe the man buried in Mound 1 had been a mercenary in the Byzantine army, maybe that means that it can't actually have been the great King Redwald. I searched through the article and I could not find anything that actually says, therefore he is not a king, therefore he's not Redwald. So what's the actual story?
First of all, you can't say from this idea that this particular burial and this particular person buried here had been to the Eastern Mediterranean. I certainly can't prove that as an idea, but I also wouldn't want to push that hard. But I also don't think it means that the Sutton Hoo cemetery isn't a royal cemetery. On the other hand, it does give us a model, I think, for how someone might acquire status and recognition and wealth of the kind that we find in Sutton Hoo. I've always been anxious about wanting to tie up a particular burial with one of the very few people whose name we know from this period in time, when there were so many others with extraordinary stories to tell. So I'm not saying it isn't a king. Sutton Hoo Mound 1 isn't a burial of a king, but I've also, maybe controversially, found it hard ever really to care whether this is Redwald. Partly, I think, for that cautiousness, that there were lots of other amazing people around at that time. Why should it be one of the very few whose name we know?
I'm with you on that, because what I don't want is for it to be all closed off. We know it's Redwald, we don't need to do any more work, it's all simply understood and a simple story. I think that's really boring. I've always been a great exponent of throwing in a few other names or a few other circumstances and seeing if we can make several stories or more exciting stories. I think that this really chimes with what I believe about how it's such a rich story of people who have very wide contacts, who are elites on a European and even further level, and who are really knowledgeable about how to construct a kingdom which could be the heir to Rome. People have said, well, how could they possibly know? How could they possibly know when the Roman Empire came to an end 200 years before Sutton Hoo, Mound 1 was made? And of course the answer is, well, it didn't come to an end everywhere. It may have come to an end in Britain, but there's still a very vibrant culture that you can take ideas from, very useful ideas, that is, I haven't done the maths, but a few weeks' journey away?
Yeah, that's right. I did have a go at trying to do the maths, and it isn't much more than that. There are some specific things about Sutton Hoo Mound 1 that would potentially make sense here, like those tiny little lumps of tar that were found in the ship burial, and when they were chemically analysed, it turns out that they probably came from Syria. Why would that be? I think it's very, very easy for us to patronise people in this time. And one of the things that, for me, this really has changed is a sense of their connectedness with the Roman world at that time. We often think about their interest in Romanness as being backward looking to a distant grand past. And I really don't think it was. I think it was about a contemporary awareness of the Roman world at that time. And it's really clear that they absolutely were aware of what was currently going on and had access to objects that were contemporaneous. And there was a moment when I realized that had one of these men walked into one of the shops in the Eastern Mediterranean at this time, they would have been familiar with a huge range of the stuff that was being sold there. There's this wonderful site at Sardis in Turkey where an earthquake buried a whole shopping street in the early 7th century. And a lot of material culture from there was available to Anglo-Saxons at the time.
It is such an intriguing thought and sheds just such a completely new light on what was going on at Sutton Hoo, making the mystery even more tantalising, I think. Thank you so much, Helen, for coming on to the Time Team podcast to explain it to us.
Thank you very much. It's fun.
It's amazing, isn't it, how even after all these decades of archaeology and research, there's just still so much to uncover about Sutton Hoo, which is, I suppose, exactly why we're going back later this year. And I know someone, by the way, Helen, who is equally as excited as us, if not more. Hi, Katrina.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I worked there 40 years ago, so I met all of the old supervisors I worked with and all the students. So, yeah, I'm glad you're coming back.
Katrina, you're one of our fantastic Patreon volunteers who joined us on site last year, and you're coming back for more this year.
I am indeed, and I've watched Time Team and been a supporter for many years, so it was a very surreal experience and absolutely brilliant. I so enjoyed it, and I can't wait to come back again.
Oh, well, we can't wait to have you back. What's it like digging at Sutton Hoo? I mean, what an experience.
Digging is really, really beautiful. I've always wanted to be an archaeologist since I was 2. I had to keep pinching myself. I was really sitting in the Time Team dome.
We're really looking forward to seeing you later on in the year, and thanks ever so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, and I can't wait to come back.
All right, questions time now on the Time Team podcast. Not very much time for these because we've absolutely crammed this podcast full of really interesting stuff. So I'm just going to bring you one question. These are all asked, by the way, by our Patreon supporters. So if you want to ask a question on a future edition of the podcast, do head to Patreon, become a supporter there, and you can ask any question you like. I've just picked one for this episode, and it's one about Sutton Hoo. It comes from Andrew Kidd, who says, "Love the podcast. Oh, thank you, Andrew. Question regarding Sutton Hoo. Some mounds were robbed. Do we know when? Were some desecrated by the next generation, as in Egypt? I believe there's some evidence of both very early and much later intrusion. Is this correct? Cheers from South Australia." Hello to South Australia. What do you think to that one then, Helen?
Well, there has indeed been some research into graves, particularly in Kent, Anglo-Saxon graves, that shows that there was some robbing very early on. And it's been done in the context of a European study. And quite how much that is the case at Sutton Hoo, it is really, really difficult to tell. Because it seems as if the more quickly you go into a grave, I suppose it's logical really, before everything's begun to fall apart, you can actually sneak quite a lot of objects out, and it's really hard for the modern archaeologist to tell. And it's particularly hard at Sutton Hoo because we have two periods of robbing that we can see really clearly. They've got a different kind of archaeological signatures. The first one is 16th or 17th century, and that is characterised by the digging of a pit down into the centre of the mound from the top of it. And it's dated mainly from Mound 1, where a sherd of pottery was dropped, giving us a date. So it's a 16th or 17th century salt-glazed stoneware jug called a Bartman jug. So it's probably the remains of a bit of a picnic that the grave robbers, or they probably thought of themselves as excavators, I don't know, were having. And the theory goes that lots of the mounds, maybe all of the mounds may have been attacked like that. But the reason that we have Mound 1 and Mound 17 particularly still intact is that the deposits in Mound 1 and Mound 17 weren't actually in the middle of the mound. Mound 17 had two graves, the grave of a horse and the grave of a young man, off centre underneath a mound. So the pit was dug through the middle and it didn't hit either of them. And in Mound 1, a field boundary, a medieval field boundary, had been dug across the end of Mound 1. So it had dug one end away. So in effect, the middle had moved. So again, the grave robbers dug down, missed it completely by about 6 inches. It was a close run thing. But then we get a second period of robbing in probably the 1860s. And we date that from a newspaper account which said that a mound was opened in 1860 and 2 bushels of iron screw bolts were found and taken to the blacksmiths to be forged down into horseshoes.
Oh, no.
Now, I know. But the great thing is that we do at least have this account, and we've got a weight. So we can work out fairly much how many ship rivets, because those were the iron screw bolts.
I was thinking that's what they are, isn't it?
Yep. So we can work out, first of all, how big the ship was in Mound 2, and secondly, we know it must have been Mound 2 because we don't have ships in any other mound that we have evidence for. So it seems pretty likely that there weren't any other ships, although tantalisingly Mounds 8 and 9, we still don't know much about what was in them. Assuming it was Mound 2, when we came to excavate Mound 2, we found that it had this big trench driven right through it from one side. So instead of climbing up to the top and digging down through it, they're going from one side. Just like if you have seen the dig, that's the way that Basil Brown did it as well. It was the standard method for digging a mound. You go in at one end and you dig a huge trench. And similar big trenches like that have been found in Mounds 5 and 6 and 7. You can imagine how those could have removed all evidence of previous robbing. So a lot of mounds may have been robbed twice. Now, the theory goes that if Mounds 5, 6 and 7 at least had been robbed before, these big trenches go in and they find pretty much nothing because the earlier robbers have probably taken away everything that's valuable. And so the theory is that after those, the grave robbers give up. They've had a look at Mounds 2, 5, 6 and 7, which are along the trackway, and they never bother to go a little bit further towards the river and try Mound 17 and 1, which of course, certainly Mound 1, that would have been found by this trench technique, and if it had been found in the 1860s, there would have been no careful planning, there'd have been no photographs, there would just have been almost nothing to go on. Anybody who wants to know what Mound 1 would have looked like if it had been dug in 1860 should go and look at the terrible debacle of Taplow, a similar grave mound that was had a tree growing on top. It was excavated so badly that the tree collapsed into the trench, and you can imagine what was lost. It was ghastly. So a lot of robbing happened at Sutton Hoo is the short answer, and we are incredibly lucky to have had any graves survive it.
Yeah, well, we wouldn't be doing an entire episode on all the amazing stuff that we hope to do in Sutton Hoo in 2025 if there hadn't have been that element of luck, which meant that those robbers didn't find exactly what they were looking for. Brilliant question. Thank you very much, Andrew. Do keep those questions coming in for future episodes. Doesn't just have to be about Sutton Hoo. Anything that you want to know about archaeology, specific digs, questions for Helen, just head to Patreon, patreon.com/TimeTeamOfficial. Now, just before we go here on the Time Team podcast, we'd like to tell you about something brand new and very exciting. It's coming your way in a few days' time.
Yes, it's something new from Time Team over on our YouTube channel, which we think you're going to love. We're making a Time Team News Special. It's a magazine programme which showcases new archaeological discoveries, in-depth conversation and so much more. And it's being presented by Derek Pittman. So let's have a quick chat with him. Derek, it feels like you're never off this podcast.
I know. I should get my name in the subheading.
You really should. Well, tell us, what's this Time Team News Special all about then?
Wow, it's something very new and it's something we've not really tried before. So we're going to get a bunch of people, a few Time Team regulars and a few perhaps newish faces into a actual fully fledged studio. Teaming up with the media department where I work at Bournemouth University, and we're going to have a whole team of media students producing it. So a team of 10 to 15 people, multiple cameras, studio lights, an audience. And we're going to talk through what's coming up this year on Time Team and some of the exciting archaeological stories from around the world.
So the big question that we all want to know, though, Derek, is are you going to have professional hair and makeup?
I need it. I need it.
For Derek specifically.
I think looking at the video staring back at me, I would probably need both of those things very much.
I'm sure you've probably got a department somewhere that you can use in the university. But for us, when and how are people going to be able to watch it?
I believe it's coming out at the end of the month, but we're filming it very soon. I'm being a little intentionally vague on the details, largely because we're going to try a variety of different things, and I'm quite excited to see how some of them turn out. But to give a little bit of insight into the behind-the-scenes process, just 2 days ago, we had a bit of a tour of the studio, and we spoke to some of the directors and the staff who were setting it up for us, and they let me and Meg try out some of the equipment and try using the studio cameras, and we got to try for the first time in my life an auto cue, which was terrifying. But the best thing was, and this made my day, they just had any old script that was randomly loaded in there, and it happened to be a bedtime story, so we got to read the Gruffalo to each other a few times.
Oh, that's marvellous.
That is marvellous. I would have liked to have seen that. Well, sounds very good. Sounds like you've been doing a lot of rehearsal and you're getting very prepared, so we're looking forward to it.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, well, best of luck, Derek. We will be watching and hoping to see a really brilliant programme.
I hope so too.
Right, that's about it from the Time Team podcast this time. Don't forget to hit follow on your podcast provider so you never miss an episode. And if you know someone who you think would really, really enjoy this podcast, for goodness sake, tell them about it.
And there's also Patreon too. We really couldn't make Time Team happen without your support there. So if you haven't considered it yet, head to patreon.com/TimeTeamOfficial to find out all about the extra content that you get if you decide you'd like to contribute financially to the archaeological work we do right across the country and the shows we make for everybody on YouTube.
Yeah, on Patreon right now, by the way, an extended version of our interview with Dr Helen Gittos, which you just heard. You can watch that if you want to over on Patreon. Head there now for that exclusive. We will speak to you next time, where I'm off to an absolutely freezing cold site in the Cotswolds, and it's all digger driver John's fault, Helen. It was like -3. It was Baltic.
And did he lock the cab so you couldn't get in?
Yeah, and then sort of, looked smug at me from the inside.
From his heated cab.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, that's all on the next episode of the Time Team podcast. So for today, thanks very much for listening. It's been lovely to have your company, and goodbye.
Goodbye.